Greetings. I'm talking to you at a time when there are demonstrations going on across the country, many American cities. This is quite unusual. They seem to be gathering strength. And the object of their protestation is a major financial institution known as banks. And it could lead us to think this is a pattern into which we have fallen in our society, where we set up these institutions to carry out very necessary functions in society, and the next thing you know, these institutions are abusing their prerogative, their privileges, and we have to go through the trouble of getting rid of these things which we went through the trouble of setting up. So what seems to be going on here is these institutions, as I say, for the most part have absolutely legitimate, in fact, absolutely necessary functions. Who's going to say that we don't want a healthcare system? Who's going to say that we don't want a communication system, a post office, an education system? Who's going to say that we don't want a government? But something happens to these systems to make them forget their function and to start, like being predatory on society, and people have to say, wait, stop doing this. It's all very inefficient. And I think part of the trick is when we say the institutions are doing this, because institutions don't do anything. People do everything. So what's really happening is people get into those institutions and misuse them. And perhaps the clearest example of that is healthcare, though education being a very close second. Because the function of healthcare is to keep people healthy, and take care of them when they're sick. But other people who are neither patients nor doctors look at this thing and say, ooh, there's a lot of desire there. There's a lot of money changing hands. We can get in and siphon off some of that money, and those people are known as insurance companies, or they start institutions called insurance companies. It's interesting that in India, from times immemorial, there was a certain type of doctor who was an expert on snake bites. They were called Visha-Vaidyas, or poison doctors. And by long tradition, the Visha-Vaidyas never charged anyone any money. They made their living some other way. The reason being that if you're bitten by a cobra in India, you get into a state of high panic. You've got like minutes to get cured. You run into one of these doctors, he could say, I've always liked that farm of yours. He could take everything. And so to protect the institution against that kind of abuse, they made it a practice never to charge money. I'm not proposing that we have a healthcare system that does that, but what would be the ways that we could stop this cycle from these perfectly legitimate institutions being taken over and turned into predatory mode against its own people, and then the people have to get rid of those institutions or figure out whether to reform them or what we should do. And it struck me that there's three possible things you can do. You can have the institution regulated by laws so that people don't abuse them. That makes perfect sense. The only problem is it doesn't seem to work. Right now there's so much evasion and so little legislation, so little control, that although it makes perfect sense, somehow it isn't working. The second thing that you can do is much more useful but more difficult, and that is to restructure the institution so that they won't be vulnerable to that kind of abuse. They won't present such a big target to predatory people. That is very helpful, and roughly speaking, it's pretty clear how to do this. And Gandhi did talk about this. He said, if India is to be free, if India is to be a democracy, she will have to decentralize many things. So it's the accumulation of power that makes these institutions vulnerable to abuse. If you decentralize them, it becomes much less efficient to occupy them for the wrong purpose. But as I say, this is difficult. The third way is even more difficult, but in the end, I think it's ultimately the way to fix the whole system. And that is to create a culture in which people are not so tempted to abuse other people through institutional or other means. And the way that you can do that is to get people to understand that they are not going to be fulfilled by indefinite consumption of objects, that in fact they themselves are not objects, that the way to fulfillment lies through relationships. And you can deepen relationships through service and fulfill that emptiness, that yearning hunger that we have inside of us, that we're trying to fulfill now by accumulating cars and boats and planes and wrecking the planet in the process and cutting ourselves off from other people in the process. So we have these three ways that we can fix this, break this cycle of these predatory institutions, or institutions on which people use for predatory purposes. The easiest one that doesn't seem to be working is pass laws. The next hardest one, which would probably work much better, is to decentralize them. And the hardest way of all that would work permanently is to change the culture, especially change the image of the human being, so that people anywhere throughout the culture would not be tempted to abuse others. They wouldn't feel the need. They wouldn't use even the largest, most central systems, because they would naturally be fulfilled in their local area with the people right around them. So that is a thought I'd like to share with you on this occasion, and as we go back to talking now about Mahatma Gandhi, we'll see how that can be implemented in our present situation.